Thanks, Dave.
Well, thank you very much. I want to first of all thank all the organizing committees that are involved in this particular meeting, but it's for a reason a little different than you might think, because I, for the first time, I'm able to publicly confess I am a DNA addict. My addiction was so strong that I asked the governor 4 years ago to appoint me to the bench so that I could somehow escape all the temptations in the district attorney's office of using DNA evidence. And the governor had mercy and appointed me to the bench. So the first cases I were assigned were DNA cases. It got so bad that I volunteered at our court just 2 months ago to go to our own court's version of the Betty Ford Clinic, and that is our juvenile court. And by juvenile court, I don't mean juvenile delinquency cases, because I thought there was some chance of my running into DNA there. I volunteered for what we call dependency cases in California. That's where you decide whether or not to take children away from parents, try to reunify the parents, and if not, try to have young children adopted. So in my first week of hearing cases last week, what do I hear but a request for an order for paternity testing? So the temptations have just been too great. But I want to go back in time briefly and describe to you my one encounter with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the crime laboratory, where they had a chance to intervene in my addiction. Because in about 15 years ago, I think it was around 1991, the Bureau was about to begin casework analysis using PCR-based DNA methods, in particular typing at one genetic marker that many of you are probably aware of, the old DQ alpha marker from way back when. And before they began casework, they wanted to have a moot court exercise. And they asked if I'd come back to the laboratory, I think it was down at the Academy in Quantico, and play a defense attorney, cross-examine the analysts who would begin casework about a mock exercise. And this particular exercise was a sexual assault case in which vaginal swabs were tested, and there were DNA testing results obtained. So I prepared for that exercise. And after hearing the direct examination, I looked at this analyst who was about to begin casework, and I think the first question out of my mouth was, well, did you ever look at those swabs under a microscope? And the answer I was told was, no, we don't feel that that's necessary. Well, then I turned to the one question I was prepared for. Well, isn't it true that the best tool you have as an analyst is your eyes? And before the analyst could even answer, some of the hair and fiber analysts in the back row of the classroom yelled out, right on. So that intervention didn't work. So here I am, a publicly confessed addict. Now, I do want to use this opportunity to talk to you about one case. Actually, the last case I prosecuted in the district attorney's office back in 2002, because I think it will give you an example of the importance of trace evidence. This was perhaps the most I know it was the most publicized case in our county's history, and it was a very sensational case because it involved the disappearance of the young girl on the right, a little girl named Danielle Van Dam, from her home, from her bedroom at night in an affluent neighborhood of San Diego. Within a few days, the man who lived 2 doors down was developed as a suspect. He made statements to the police, and the police had simply been canvassing the neighborhood to try to get any leads as to how this disappearance had occurred. Mr. Westerfield gave some statements to police. The investigation began to focus on him, and in the course of that investigation, some important evidence was developed. In particular, it turned out that 2 days after her disappearance, Mr. Westerfield had taken some clothing into a local cleaner's. That clothing was obtained by police. It had a pair of blood stains that you can see on this particular jacket that DNA typing revealed a strong association with Danielle Van Dam's blood from those particular blood samples. That investigation also led to an examination of a motorhome that belonged to Mr. Westerfield, inside of which was a wealth of material, including a blood stain that was similarly typed using DNA techniques that associated Danielle Van Dam with that blood, along with some other items, including hair. That hair, for instance, those that had a sufficient root attached to them, was subjected to STR DNA typing with some powerful results. Hairs that didn't have a sufficient root attached were tested using mitochondrial DNA types. So the police department began to put together what appeared to be a powerful case against this particular defendant. But suddenly there was a monkey wrench. And the monkey wrench was 2 facts. As the case investigation later revealed, first of all, Danielle Van Dam had been in Mr. Westerfield's house with her mother selling Girl Scout cookies just a few days before the disappearance. In addition, his motorhome had been out in front of his home, remember, only 2 doors down from where Danielle Van Dam lived, with the door open when Westerfield would prepare to leave on a trip using his motorhome. So that had the effect, potentially, of significantly diluting that evidence, that DNA evidence. So law enforcement, fortunately, didn't stop there. This now became a question of, all right, this DNA evidence exists, but how powerful will it be, despite the strong associations between the victim and the defendant's motorhome, versus what about all the other evidence? And because the investigation had focused on this particular man fairly quickly, and there had been an extensive investigation and searches of both the Van Dam house, 2 doors down, as well as the Westerfield house, again, very closely, that led to tape lifts after tape lifts after tape lifts. And of course, there were fibers on all of those tape lifts and hairs on those tape lifts, which became a monumental task in terms of prioritizing. What do you look at? What do you go through first? Well, fortunately, the analysts in that laboratory began to inventory as time permitted. Well, what are the fibers or hairs that we're seeing? Obviously, hairs that were similar in appearance to Danielle Van Dam's could be screened and forwarded if necessary for DNA testing, and that was done. As far as fibers were concerned, when this young girl's body was found, and her body wasn't found until about 2 weeks after her disappearance, and it was found in a remote area, perhaps 20 miles from where she actually lived. But when the body was recovered, you can see this choker chain that was on her, around her neck, that was still there at the time her body was recovered. And when those analysts began to look at that choker chain, they found hairs, but they also found an orange polyester fiber, a single fiber. Well, then it became a question of, well, can that be associated with anything in the environment of the defendant? They began to look at additional fibers as well. The choker chain you see in that photograph second from the left, but also found were a number of hairs that were gray in color and similar in appearance to the victim's own dog, a Weimaraner named Layla. In addition, there were blue nylon fibers that were found in a bed sheet that was used to recover the body of Danielle Van Dam from the site where her body was found, and there were additional orange fibers as well. But again, where were these fibers, where was this trace evidence located so that it could have or might have some impact on discovering who had committed this particular crime? Well, it turned out that these fibers were located heavily in Mr. Westerfield's laundry room, found not only in items that were sitting on top of the washer, clothes washer, also items found inside the dryer, and even found on clothing that was inside the washer as well. So this picture started to become a little clearer, but bear in mind the association, that is the fact that she had consensually been in the house earlier. But again, because of the number of these fibers, it was becoming more significant. Ultimately, in the upstairs area of the home, and when Danielle Van Dam had been in the house, she had been in the living room and dining room area only on the first floor. On the second floor, in Westerfield's master bedroom, these same hairs and fibers were located in the bed itself. Obviously, that was playing a more significant role in associating the two. All of this information was put together by 2 analysts in the San Diego Police Department laboratory, and I'm going to embarrass Tanya Delaney, who's sitting over here right now, along with Jennifer Shen, who worked hour after hour, day after day, looking at this material to see if there were any important associations. And also Faye Springer, who was asked to look at some of the dog hairs that were ultimately forwarded for mitochondrial DNA testing, believe it or not, which we were able to obtain results. All of that work was done in a capital murder case in which the defendant never waived time. He demanded a speedy trial. So the crime itself occurred in February, the trial occurred, and he was sentenced by the jury, at least the jury recommended a death verdict in September of that same year. That's quicker than any murder case I've ever been involved in. But by sorting through all that material, they were able to develop these associations of hairs and fibers that, frankly, DNA testing didn't play as big a role in because of the focus that occurred in that particular case. The other point I wanted to make to you is the fact that with regard to hairs in particular, Even if those hairs are subjected to DNA testing and mitochondrial DNA testing or nuclear DNA testing produces results, sometimes they're not very powerful, particularly with mitochondrial DNA testing. To give you an example, by referring to a database of dogs, it was determined that the mitochondrial DNA profile shared by those hairs that were found in the defendant's environment that were consistent with having come from the victim's dog were found in roughly 1 out of 11 dogs. That's not very powerful. Certainly is a failure to exclude, which can be very important. However, in addition to that, what characteristic do hairs have? Unlike blood that doesn't come in different colors, so to speak, hairs do come in different colors with different consistencies, different lengths, and so on. And those morphological features of those particular hairs, in addition to DNA evidence, made that evidence much stronger. Because jurors obviously know that all hairs aren't blonde, or all dog hairs aren't gray. They come in a variety of colors and lengths and so on. So I think it's important to bear in mind that power of trace evidence to add. Now, whoops, better stop here for just a moment. Just a brief background. The last item I have for you is a short video clip that occurred in this case, but I want to give you a very brief backdrop to it. And that is, this case, at its end, shifted to a focus on forensic entomology evidence, that is, bug activity, basically. And the position of the defense was that because there had not been a great deal of bug activity, insect activity, the body hadn't been left in the location where it was found for more than a few days. The reason that was important is, for the last several days, Mr. Westerfield was under surveillance by law enforcement. And if the body had been deposited during that time, it couldn't have been by him because he was under a 24-hour watch. The position that the prosecution took was that because the weather at the time this occurred in February of 2002, and in the midst of the biggest drought that San Diego County had had since the Civil War, literally, we had about 2.5 inches of rain that year, and we had a very dry, non-humid environment during that time, that the body wasn't receptive, it wasn't attractive to insect activity. So in the course of that, there were a number of experts called by both sides. The reason I want to show you this last video clip is because it demonstrates the unpredictability of what can happen in court. The defense called this particular expert, whose name is unimportant, and during the course of their examination of that expert, they got into mathematical calculations and the difference between median and mean. And I could tell sitting there that I didn't think the expert knew what median and mean even meant. So I jabbed the primary prosecutor in the case, Jeff Dushek, the man you'll hear asking a question, in the side, and I said, look, Jeff, I don't think he knows the difference. Why don't you ask that on cross-examination? And Jeff's answer to me was, I don't understand the difference. So I said, give it a shot. You'll see Jeff slips up for a moment. But again, this is used as an example of what can happen in court.
I don't know.
You talk about your criticism of Dr. Goff. One of the factors, I think, was some mathematical errors you said he made?
I found a couple of arithmetic errors.
Okay. Help me out. There are two terms I'm concerned with, median and mean, regarding numbers. Do you know which one's which?
As far as I know, the median and mean are essentially synonymous.
Isn't there one where median means average? Mean means average, and median means simply the midpoint between various numbers above and below.
Mean, the mean, and it may not be the answer. You know, the mean is a value that never can be known. The average is an estimate of the mean. The median is a much more amorphous term. Some of the entomological data in this area has been accumulated as the mode, and so you can talk about the mean, median, and mode. Does that get at your question?
No.
Okay.
Jeff is a man of very few words, and he obviously showed it there. I want to just simply emphasize to all of you how, even for a DNA addict like me, trace evidence plays an extremely important role. And I think this case was an example of how, despite having what many would consider extremely powerful DNA evidence, that because of the particular circumstances of the case, it was trace evidence that made the difference. All right, thank you very much.